I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr Ron Ehrlich. Well, today we're going to explore diabetes, go back to basics, see why it is such a problem, how big a problem it is, how we've gone with the science in medicine up to this point in time, and where we can go from here. My guest today is Dr Peter Brukner. He is the founder of Defeat Diabetes and also a not-for-profit SugarByHalf. Peter's been a guest on the podcast before. He is a world-renowned sports medicine clinician, researcher, formerly the Chief Medical Officer for the Australian men's cricket team, and has also held similar roles at Liverpool Football Club, Melbourne and Collingwood Australian AFL clubs, the Socceroos, the Australian soccer team, and the Australian Olympic athletics team. Peter is currently Professor of Sports Medicine at Trobe University, Victoria. Peter is just a wealth of knowledge and experience. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Dr. Peter Brukner. Welcome back to the show, Peter.
Great to be speaking again, Ron. That's fantastic. Yeah.
Peter, today we're going to talk about diabetes, and I don't want us to assume that, everyone hears the word, but do they know what it means? I just wondered if we might start with, what is diabetes and why is it such a problem?
Yeah, look, good question. And people are confused because there's different types of diabetes and you hear about it. So let's go back to basics. And basically, diabetes is a disorder of your glucose metabolism. Okay, so it means that your body is unable to process glucose properly. Now, there's two main types. Let's stick to the two main types of diabetes. There are a couple of others that are a bit rarer, but let's stick to the two main ones. And they're completely different diseases, and they probably shouldn't both be called diabetes because that confuses people. But it's type 1 and type 2. And type 1 diabetes is probably the more severe, you'd say. And it tends to occur when people are young, sometimes children, sometimes young adults. It can come on later, but generally when it affects young people. And it's probably an autoimmune disease in which your pancreas is the organ in your body that basically controls your sugar, okay? So because it releases the hormone insulin, and insulin is essential. If you don't have insulin, you die, basically. So insulin's really important. So what happens for the normal person, when you have some sugar or carbohydrates, starches, you eat that, your body breaks that, or your gastrointestinal system breaks that down into glucose. And your glucose is absorbed into your blood. And glucose is a very important nutrient. And to stop that or to enable that glucose to be used around the body, when the body absorbs glucose, the pancreas, this organ on your stomach, secretes a hormone called insulin. And insulin is the hormone that drives the sugar out of the blood into the tissues. And that's really important because if your blood glucose gets too high, you become very, very sick and ultimately, you can't survive. So insulin is really important to drive that sugar out of your bloodstream into the tissues where it's used for fuel or it's stored as fat. Now, in type 1 diabetes, for some reason that we don't really understand, the body sort of attacks itself and the part of the pancreas that produces the insulin stops working. And so basically you stop producing insulin. So it's a very serious condition in that you don't produce insulin, your blood glucose gets too high, and the effect is disastrous. So type 1 diabetes, people with that disease, young people often, need to inject insulin. So basically, until insulin came on the scene 100 years ago or so, people died basically when we had type 1 diabetes. And insulin's been a lifesaver. And people now inject insulin and basically survive. So that's type 1 diabetes. That's far less common, but far more serious and severe because you basically have a lifetime of injecting insulin. So the second type of diabetes is what we call type 2 diabetes. And that's a very different disease. And it tends to occur later in life. And you still produce insulin. But what happens is over a period of time is that your body becomes what we call resistant to the effect of that insulin. And it's a little bit like if you're drinking alcohol. The more alcohol, after a period of time, you need more and more alcohol to get you drunk. It's a little bit like the same with insulin. And if you're producing lots of insulin, if you're eating lots of carbohydrates over a period of time, many people, and there's some genetic component to it. Not everyone gets it, but generally people become resistant to the effect of that insulin, and as a result, requires more and more insulin to drive the glucose out of the bloodstream into the tissues, and ultimately the body can't produce enough insulin, and the blood sugar rises. And so that's really what occurs in diabetes. You have elevated blood glucose, which is called hyperglycemia. Now it's interesting. I mean, back when I was at medical school, and then when you were studying, we used to call this disease mature onset diabetes. Unfortunately, sadly, they had to change the name to type 2 because people were getting it younger and younger. This was a fairly rare sort of disease that some elderly people used to get a generation or two ago. Now we're seeing teenagers with type 2 diabetes, and it's largely because of the way we eat. So basically how you can summarize diabetes is that diabetes is a disease of carbohydrate intolerance. Okay, in that our bodies are unable in type 1 because there's no insulin, and in type 2 because we're resistant to the insulin. But for whatever reason, our bodies don't tolerate carbohydrate. Now, you would think it was pretty obvious what the solution to that was. But if I asked you what has been the recommended diet for people with diabetes for the last 50 years, you'd probably say, well, the obvious thing is, reduce carbohydrate. But no, not correct.
Yes.
The recommended diet has been a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet because of this obsession we have with fat. Because I think it probably as a result of diabetes leads to cardiovascular disease, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But and everyone's obsessed about fat and cardiovascular disease. So people have become totally distracted and forgotten the actual reason why people become, or the basic behind diabetes is carbohydrate intolerance. We've become overwhelmed by this fat thing, and as a result, we've been recommending this low-fat, high sort of starchy carbohydrate diet, which has been the worst thing you can imagine. You're giving someone who's carbohydrate intolerant a diet high in carbohydrate, and when you think about it, and I didn't for many years, I have to say, but when you actually think about the logic of it, it's totally irrational. But because of this obsession we've had over the last 30 or 40 years with fat and cholesterol, and as we discussed last time, based on a lot of dodgy science and a lot of politics and power and so on, we've lost sight of what the real problem. And as a result, diabetes and type 2 diabetes in particular is a massive problem in our society. I actually think it's the biggest single health problem in this country and in Western society. We have officially, I think the numbers are 1.2 million Australians with type 2 diabetes. I think type 1 diabetes is about 100,000, but type 2 is the one I'm really focused on. And type 2 diabetes, the official numbers are about 1.2 million. The feeling out there in the medical fraternity is that there's probably another 500,000 who are walking around with type 2 diabetes that probably haven't been diagnosed yet, because often you don't get symptoms till quite late. So that's going on for 2 million people with type 2 diabetes. The estimates are that there's probably another 2 million people suffering from what we call pre-diabetes, and we can talk a bit about that later. But a significant proportion of those people will go on to develop type 2 diabetes unless they make the changes that we're going to talk about. So this is a huge problem. Now you might say, well, people don't tend to die of diabetes. You don't hear of people dying of diabetes, but Diabetes is the underlying cause because the high blood sugar levels damage the arteries, and as a result, they cause damage to a whole lot of different organs. So, for example, type 2 diabetes is the most common cause of blindness in Australia. It's the most common cause of kidney disease, kidney transplants, dialysis. So it's probably implicated in most people with cardiovascular disease, with heart problems. It certainly is the most common cause of amputations and peripheral vascular disease, people's toes and legs having to be amputated. And it's very closely related with dementia and Alzheimer's. And in fact, Alzheimer's is sometimes called type 3 diabetes, such as the close relationship between the two. So, the disease I've just mentioned there are the biggest health problems in this country. And for many of them, the underlying cause is type 2 diabetes. That's why we are so obsessed, really, with getting type 2 diabetes under control.
Now it's interesting, Peter, because you've mentioned eyesight, you've mentioned limbs. We've actually had on as guests Gary Fettke and Belinda, of course, and we've also had James Mookie, the Australian of the Year in 2020. And you've just said, this was something I wasn't. And here you are, given your position in sports medicine globally, nationally, et cetera. And it wasn't something that you were aware of either. James had a similar story. Gary had a similar story until he became aware of it. What is about it? What is it about our medical education? Does it kind of mentally just cut off at the basic sciences? Once we get onto pharmacology, that's when we're really studying, or surgery, we're really studying real medicine. Is that part of the problem?
Yeah, I think it is. I think there are a few issues. I think, for a start, our whole medical degree, I didn't have a single lecture on nutrition in my 6 years of medicine. Not one. Well, maybe I was away that day. But anyway, I don't think I did. I can't remember it anyway. Yes. We have biochemistry sort of stuff, but not nutrition. I didn't have one on exercise. I don't think I had one on stress. That wasn't talked about. This is a while ago, but I don't think things have changed that much, to be honest. And doctors, we're funny sort of people, but we're like most people in that you stay in your comfort zone. And the comfort zone for doctors is pharmacology, it's drugs and surgery. Because that's what we're taught. That's what we're taught. We're taught that is the solution. We know all about pharmacology and drugs and so on. And we're taught that, at X disease, Y drug, Y disease, Z surgery. They're the two options. And so you stay in your comfort zone. Someone comes to you and most doctors don't feel comfortable talking about nutrition. So the easy thing is just to, refer to the dietitian or refer to the dietary guidelines, which are outdated and wrong. And so it's not. I just sort of don't. I do and don't blame doctors. I think a lot of the time we do sort of stop thinking. We're so busy and so focused on what we're doing day to day that we don't actually have time to go back and sort of think, well, hang on, is this right? I heard a great saying once that someone said that 50% of everything you get taught in medical school turns out to be wrong. You just have to work out which 50%. Yes. And for most of us, we still believe everything we're taught in medical school is right, and it's not the case. And things do change. Our knowledge changes. The other thing that I've learned, I guess, is through this process. When I first sort of discovered that maybe the low fat, argument was wrong. Was that. We assume that all the basics of medicine are based on good, solid science and research and so on. And when I went looking for the science and the evidence for nutrition and for low fat, it just wasn't there. I'd always assumed that the reason the whole Western society has been on a low fat diet for 30 or 40 years was because of good, solid evidence, science. Then when you go into it, the science is either fraudulent or it's sponsored by the sugar industry or by the food industry, and it's an eye opener. And it really, I remember when I first sort of started to read about this, I remember feeling quite disturbed. That I was reading this book and I would put it down at night and think, no, look, this couldn't be right. We couldn't have made such a basic mistake as this for all this time, and yet, the more you read, the more you look into it, the more you realise that, the whole advice to be obsessed about low fat and cholesterol is based on fraud and on money rather than science, which is quite scary and quite depressing in a way.
Yes, well, I think James Mookie went through a similar experience, and you as well. And I think I don't blame doctors either, in the sense that people are so busy, and they're so preoccupied with what they see in front of them, trying to manage it, that they would rightly assume that those that are government regulation or from professional, the recommendations would be something you could rely on. It's a story that's very easy to miss, but once you hear it, very difficult to ignore.
Yeah, that's right. And you've got to look at the consequences. If the advice we've been giving was right, you'd think that, well, maybe we must be getting healthier, but we're getting fatter and sicker every year. Obesity levels are going up, type 2 diabetes levels are going up. I mean, we must be doing something wrong. Yes. Because if everything was right, then then we'd be getting healthier, and we're clearly not getting healthier. So, I think we really need to. And what it's done is it's made me a bit of a sort of a skeptic. I think I sort of now question everything. Which is probably not a good thing. But I really I spend half my time now reading, trying to get to the bottom of everything that we're taught, and it's quite it's scary, some of the stuff you come up with. It's really is, and then if you stick your head up and suggest that maybe what you get shot down by the establishment. I mean, you look at Gary Fettke and Tim Noakes in South Africa, and we've all been we all have people trying to sort of take us down whenever we suggest that the current sort of status quo might be wrong, and that's scary too. That you're not allowed to challenge anything these days, and I think the problem is there's a lot of vested interests in maintaining the status quo. There's some of the pharmaceutical industry and the food industry are doing very well, thank you very much. They don't want things to change.
Yeah, I think this is part of the problem, that two basic things like food and healthcare have become commodities.
Yep. Absolutely, and commercialised.
And in a market-driven world, a market-driven economy, they're big commodities. They're big commodities, and that's not going to be surrendered. But defeat diabetes is an attempt, a serious attempt, an independently serious attempt. Tell us about defeat diabetes.
Well, I guess, I've always been, since I've sort of gone down this track, I've been worried about type 2 diabetes, and as I said, the numbers are going up, and the effects of it is massive in our society. And I sort of, keep waiting for someone to do something about it, because there seems to be an obvious solution. And ultimately, no one was doing anything about it. I think because of all those influences that we mentioned. And I'd observed that both in the UK and the US, there had been online programs that promoted a restricted carbohydrate diet and exercise and other things that have been remarkably successful. Because traditionally, what we've been taught about type 2 diabetes is that it is a chronic progressive disease. So, you go along to your doctor, Ron, and say, oh, look, I've got some bad news for you. You've got type 2 diabetes, and you say, well, what can I do about it? And he sort of shrugs his shoulders and says, well, there's not really much you can do. We can give you some drugs that help a little bit, but you've got to learn to live with it, and you'll get all the consequences of it. Well, that's very depressing. I mean, it just doesn't give people hope at all. Doesn't give doctors hope. Doesn't give patients hope. But now there is accumulated evidence that restricting your carbohydrate intake can actually dramatically improve diabetes control, and in fact can put diabetes into remission. Now, we're taught that that's not possible, but the evidence overseas is that these programs, these low carb programs as they're referred to, have about a 50% remission rate. So your people get off their medication and no longer are diagnosed with diabetes. So their blood sugar levels come down to normal. Now that is incredible. There are no drugs that can do that. There's no other, form of treatment. Maybe bariatric surgery can do that, but that's pretty radical. Here's a relatively simple way of putting your type 2 diabetes into remission. So now I've been observing these two programs in the UK and the US. And initially my thought was, well, maybe we could license the UK one to Australia, and we tried to do that, and it didn't work out for a whole lot of different reasons. So sort of a year or so ago, I bit the bullet and got a couple of colleagues involved, and we decided, well, we'd write our own program. an Australian based program. So it's Australian. We determined that it would be completely evidence-based. So everything we did would be backed up by the latest science, and it would be, by Australians for Australians. As I often say, we talk about Vegemite, not Marmite. And the important things like that. So we put together an app-based program. Ultimately, we'll put out a web-based program as well, but we initially started with an app-based program. We've called it Defeat Diabetes. And in that program, there is a whole bunch of, we have 13 lessons along the way, really. And these lessons consist of videos and articles and action plans and quizzes. We've got meal plans, we've got recipes, we've got cooking demonstrations and so on. And it's really, the one-stop shop, if you like, for everything about diabetes. It gives you the background information to try and understand why, we're doing what we're doing, but also gives you the practical information right down to recipes and meal plans about how you can get on top of this. And we launched the app in January, and it's a subscription app. You get a 14-day free trial, and then you can sign up for various lengths of time. For instance, 12 months is $99, so it's less than $2 a week. So it's about half a cafe latte, I think, per week, to give you the information you need for your diabetes. And the response has been terrific. And just recently, we surveyed our first group of people who subscribed to the app. And we looked at the results after 3 months, and we'd had 62% of those people put their diabetes into remission, which is even better than overseas.
This is the condition that many doctors, and I had Rob Szabo on as a guest too, and you and Rob Taylor, and we've done a whole low carb story here.
Yeah.
But Rob is one of those doctors who was a doctor diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and felt mortified that he knew the status quo was there is no cure, we just have to manage. And within 48 hours, Rob turned it around to his surprise.
Absolutely.
And I think although you didn't you weren't diabetic, but I know you lost quite a bit of weight, over a relatively short period of time. It's interesting, without going into the biochemistry, the terms glucose and sugar and carbohydrates often get mixed up. I think it might be worth just reminding our listener, or actually telling them for the first time, why carbohydrates affect blood sugar.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Very good question. So basically, carbohydrates, there are two main types of carbohydrates. There's sugars. Okay. So I think we're all pretty familiar with sugars. Sucrose is table sugar, which consists of a molecule of glucose and a molecule of fructose. So that's part of the story. Sugars are all carbohydrates, and I think most people get the fact that too much sugar is not very good for you. The tricky thing is that there's so much hidden sugar. We all sort of realize, okay, you can't put 3 teaspoons of sugar into your coffee or whatever, or so put too much sugar on there. And we know that Coca-Cola and things like that are full of sugar, but it's all the hidden sources of sugar. So basically, pretty much all processed foods, so all packaged and canned food and so on, have added sugar, because the food industry has got us used to the taste of sweetness. So probably about 80% of processed food has added sugar. So even things that are promoted as being healthy, like breakfast cereals and fruit yogurt and breads and muesli bars and barbecue sauce and all these sort of things are full of sugar, and that's what people don't really understand. So sugars are one part of the story. The other part of the story is the category called starches. So they're the potato, rice, pasta, that sort of thing. And what a starch is it's also a carbohydrate. The starch is just a whole bunch of glucose molecules stuck together. So you ingest a starch, your body breaks that, your gastrointestinal system breaks down that starch into its constituent molecules, which is just glucose. And it's absorbed into the bloodstream as glucose. So exactly the same as having sugar, it's absorbed in the same form as in glucose. Now, the only difference is it takes a bit longer because it takes time to break it down. Whereas, you have a glass of Coke and you immediately get a rise in blood sugar. Whereas if you have a potato, it takes a little bit longer. But what people don't understand is that these starches are basically just sugar molecules or glucose molecules stuck together. So between the sugars and the starches, that's the majority of our diet, the modern diet, all processed packaged foods and so on. So, reducing carbohydrates, involves reducing both the sugars and the starches, and that's really what we're about with our dietary recommendations. So restricting the carbohydrate intake, so reducing the amount of sugar. So soft drinks, fruit juices, flavored milks. A lot of drinks have full of sugar. And then there's all the different foods that are full of sugar. And so if you basically stick to real food. So what we recommend is sticking to real food, so meat and fish and fruit and veg and dairy and eggs, all the things that have been told are bad for you, are actually a lot better than what's been replacing them, and then the sugars and starches. So it's really a matter of getting back to if you eat real food, then your carbohydrate intake is going to be restricted, and you'll be eating lots of healthy proteins and fats. The first thing you notice when that happens is you stop being so hungry. Basically, carbohydrates make you hungry. Fats and proteins fill you up. And, I used to eat probably 3 meals and 3 snacks a day. You'd have your cereal for breakfast and it was
what we were taught to do. We were told
to
keep the blood sugar level even. And in fact, it's a wonderful model for selling food.
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah, and the cereal industry is convinced us that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. There's absolutely no science for that, but everyone believes it. I mean, because we're gullible, and the food industry is they are the most brilliantly clever marketing people in the world. You look at breakfast cereals. The cereal flavored sugars. That's all they are. And yet, little Johnny's walking down the aisle with his mum, and Mama, I want that one, that brightly coloured. They're so clever the way they do these things. And they say, oh, no added sugar. Oh, why? You think, well, that's healthy, no added sugar. Yeah, but all the sugar's in the cereal or in whatever it is, and so on. So very, very clever, and they're just taking us for a ride. And the consequences are disastrous because we're getting fatter and sicker, and it's really hard to take them on.
When we do hear about low carb, low carb means different things to different people. When you're being told by the authorities that your recommended daily intake should be about 300 grams of carb, well, I think it is, Peter. I think it's about 310 grams of carbohydrate a day, and people don't really know what that means. We'll get to that in a moment. But when we're talking about, let's talk about that, because I think one of the things that's important is for people to spend a week of their lives measuring the food that they eat and recording what their carbohydrate intake is. So you need to look at the labels and pick up sugar, pick up carbohydrate content, etc. But you'd also need to weigh some food and work out what the carb. I guess there's a carb. Is there a carb counter on Defeat Diabetes?
No, there's lots of carb counters out there, though. There are apps and websites and so on that can count your carbs. Yeah, but basically, if you're having the standard, Aussie diet of lots of processed food, I mean, you're going to be up there, 250, 300 grams of carbohydrates a day. You've only got to have a normal bottle of 600 ml bottle of Coke a day, and you've got 64 grams of sugar or something. I mean, it's just the majority of people, by the time they finish breakfast, have probably had about 150 grams of carbs. If they have a glass of fruit juice and a bowl of cereal and a fruit yogurt and a piece of toast and tea with a couple of sugars, that's 150 grams of sugar, and you haven't even left home.
Yeah, and they'll be hungry, ready to have another snack at morning tea. What is low carb? How do you define low carb?
Well, I mean, it basically, most people would consider probably under 120 grams of carbs a day as low carb. And then it's degrees of low carb. And then you get down into the sort of the ketogenic, the keto type diet that people might have heard of. That's down to sort of 30 or 50, grams of carbs a day. So there's various grades. And the way I look at it is that everyone has, an ideal amount of carbs that they should be having. And it really depends on where you are in that sort of, insulin resistance. So if you're, young and fit and healthy and you're insulin sensitive and so on, you can have your 120, 150 grams of carbs a day and, you'll be okay, But if on the other hand, you're significantly overweight or you've got, type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes or metabolic syndrome or hypertension or something like that, you should be getting down towards the sort of, 30 to 50 grams of carbs a day, at least in the short term till you get your, get your metabolic health under control. And then you can just slacken off a little bit and you'll find the right amount, because your weight will remain steady and you'll feel good and your blood sugars will be fine and so on. And so that's what I did. I guess I went, pretty hard for 3 months. I didn't measure my carbs, but I just didn't have any carbs really. I would just eat, lots of, sort of eggs and bacon and avocado for breakfast. And then, dinner would be meat or fish and, green vegetables. And I'd have a few berries and a bit of cream and some nuts and so on. And so I was probably down to the sort of, 30 or 40 grams of carbs a day and did that for 3 months. Lost 13 kilograms of weight, resolved all my metabolic issues, went from being pre-diabetic with a fatty liver to absolutely normal. And then after that, I just gradually introduced a bit more fruit and the occasional, piece of sourdough bread or something, or a bit of dark chocolate or whatever. And then, I've sort of found my right amount, which is, I guessing is probably about 70 or 80 grams of carbs a day that keeps my blood sugar and my weight and me feeling good, because one of the other things is, we focus a lot on your weight and your blood sugar and so on, but it's also how you feel. You just feel so much better when you're on this, restricting your carbohydrate and so on. You sleep better, you exercise better, you concentrate better. It's, it all sounds a little bit too good to be true. And to be honest, I thought it was too good to be true to start with. I was as skeptical and cynical as anyone else about this when I first heard about it. And it was only because a colleague of mine who I respect a lot, Tim Noakes in South Africa, was so adamant that it was the way. I thought, I need to look into this more. And even though I read a lot and, was quite convinced about it, I was still skeptical until I had the experience myself. And then in 3 months, I'd had a thing called fatty liver, which is a sign of pre-diabetes. It's a disease where you basically get fat infiltration into your liver. And I'd had that for 10 years. I'd had blood tests every couple of years that you do, check up. Your bloods show you've got fatty liver. And I didn't really know what fatty liver was. I sort of ignored it. I figured I was on a low-fat diet. I'd be all right, typical doctor, not looking after yourself very well. And after this 3 months of changing my diet, fatty liver completely disappeared. Liver function back to normal. It's remained normal ever since. And I had it for 10 years. Maybe even before that, that's as far back as my blood test went. So, in the space of 3 months, maybe even less, because I only measured it at the end of the 3 months, I'd resolved this health issue that I'd had for 10 years. And that's what blew me away. I just could not believe, that a thing like diet, when drugs won't help that, the diet would do that. And it's a life-changing experience for me, as it has been for you and for many others, I think, and once you've been through it, you never go back. Because you feel so much better, so much more energy. And the only problem is you need a new wardrobe because, you lose so much weight, you need to, take in all your clothes. But I figured that was a small price to pay. So, I think it's just a no-brainer. But and we're seeing that with people who are, doing the program on the app. Every day I'm getting, a message or something on the Facebook group and saying, you've changed my life. I can't believe, why didn't I know about this before, et cetera, et cetera. So that's very, rewarding when things like that happen. No one ever told me I'd change their life and I fixed their knee or their ankle or whatever in the old days. But it's very rewarding like that. And we just want to get the message out there to as many people as possible because it is a massive issue. And the other thing, Ron, is people say, "Oh, I'm okay. My blood sugars are fine. I'll be all right." And But you don't develop type 2 diabetes overnight. It's something that takes 10, 15 years probably of gradually becoming resistant to insulin, and till a point where you actually go, bang, your blood sugars are too high. But that happens over a period of time, and much better to get, to prevent it happening than to wait till it does happen, because we know the consequences of high blood sugar are disastrous. All those diseases we talked about before, and if we can prevent that, it's our whole medical paradigm that's wrong, that we've talked about before, that we wait until people are sick and then we throw drugs at them and surgery and everything like that. It's just crazy. It just does not make any sense at all, when if we get the other things right, you get diet right, we get exercise right, we get stress right, we don't even get to these situations. We don't need drugs, but that's not good for the pharmaceutical industry, food industry and so on.
Well, it is such a huge problem, and to hear you articulate it in this way and to offer such a solution as Defeat Diabetes is, and that's why I've been very, very keen to support it. And remind us how people can access this?
Okay, well, there's two ways really. You can go straight to the App Store or the Google Play. It's both an Android and an Apple version. And you can just click on the app, the Defeat Diabetes app. As I said, you get a 14-day free trial, so plenty of time to look through it and see whether you want to continue, or you can just sign up straight away. As I said, there's 1 month, 3 month, and 12-month options. The 12-month option is it's only $2 a week. It's very easy. So and then when that happens, you become part of a Facebook group. You get emails every week. You get new recipes. You get new videos. You become part of a community and a like-minded community, people who are trying to sort of improve their health. And just, fantastic just being on the Facebook group. You hear all these great suggestions and people's experiences and ideas and recipes. And, it's great. So that, or alternatively, if you want to find out a bit more about it before you dive into the app, you can go to the Defeat Diabetes website, which is just defeatdiabetes.com.au, and have a little wander around there, and you'll find out a lot more about it. You'll see some sample videos and articles and so on, and learn a lot more. And on that also, we also have all the evidence behind it all, in case you want to get into the science of it all, and so on. So they're the two options: go straight to the app or the App Store and download the app, or you can actually go to the website and log on from there. So there are your two options. So hopefully, you'll have a good result.
Well, Peter, thank you so much, not only for this amazing initiative and the needed initiative, but thank you also for joining us today and sharing that with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Isn't it interesting to talk to people like Peter Brukner? I mean, Peter's position in sport globally is, he's a world leader. And yet he was not aware that the advice that is put forward by the organisations over the last 30 or 40 years, he just assumed it was there, it was evidence-based. Evidence-based, I think we should, I've made a note of this was a healthy bite we've done about evidence-based medicine or evidence-based marketing, but it bears repeating, because the word evidence-based is like said to absolve anybody of any other things. Once you've said the words, oh, this is evidence-based, and I know Peter used that as well, but, independent evidence-based is the key. When you say evidence-based, it's like the holy grail of everything you say after that. And the problem is that there's a very big difference between evidence-based medicine and evidence-based marketing. And part of the problem with the science in medicine is that at least 70% of the science in medicine is paid for by commercial interests, who, it needs to be said also, have a conflict of interest. And another guest on this podcast, Dr. Andrew Saul, once said, good health may make sense, but it doesn't make dollars. Well, it doesn't make dollars for the food industry, and it doesn't make dollars for the pharmaceutical industry. And when they are sponsoring research and they have the power to lobby professional organisations and government bodies and regulatory bodies to develop public health policies, which, if the evidence is anything to go by, hasn't been terribly successful. If you plot the incidence of obesity and type 2, used to be called late onset, but it's not late onset anymore, type 2 diabetes, it is actually heading upwards, and it has done ever since the dietary guidelines have been promoted so widely. Now, it's worth noting also this figure: 4 grams of sugar or carbohydrate equals 4 grams, is a teaspoon of sugar. So 4 grams of sugar or carbohydrates is a teaspoon of sugar. And then there's the fiber component of carbohydrates we need to consider as well. So that is why when you are going down this path, I actually do think it's a worthwhile exercise for a week of your life to just look at labels and keep a little note of how much carbohydrate you're consuming. Even for a day or two, it will be an eye-opener. For example, if you have a juice, or as Peter said, if you have a juice or a smoothie, a bowl of cereal, some yogurt, it's quite likely that by the end of that meal, you may have already consumed 100 to 120 grams of carbohydrates or sugar. They use those two words almost interchangeably. I know there are complex carbohydrates which break down slower, and that's a good thing. But just focus on your carbohydrate and sugar intake in a 24-hour period. And I thought it was interesting to note what is a reasonable level. Peter said if you were fit and healthy and doing a lot of exercise, 120, 150 grams of carbohydrate a day wouldn't be a problem. Personally, I, at my age, at my stage in life, feel that a very sustainable level of carbohydrate on a daily basis is around 70 to 80 grams. I totally agree with Peter on that one. But if you have just been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and you're wanting to bring that back under control, then for a period of time, and who knows how long that will be, it will certainly be for at least a couple of months, but maybe you'll feel so good you'll want to continue that on for longer. A carbohydrate level of 20 to 30 grams of carbohydrate a day will bring that back under control. Will it put you into remission? Well, the science says 50 to 60% of the time it probably will, which is a hell of a lot better than there is no cure for type 2 diabetes. We just have to learn to manage it for the rest of your life. Now, I'd refer you back to an episode we did with Dr. Rob Szabo. In fact, I did a whole lot of episodes about low-carb living with Dr. Rob Szabo, who was a doctor in his late 30s, fit and healthy, who was shocked to be diagnosed, and I know Rob won't mind me mentioning this, was shocked to be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and had been advising his own patients of exactly what Peter Brukner had just said. There's no cure, we just have to manage. And then he stumbled upon a low-carb option and literally, and this was I think he was in his late 30s at the time, literally turned around his health in about 48 hours, to his surprise, to his shock, to his great relief, and to the benefit of the rest of his life. So don't let your doctor tell you that there is no evidence to support X, Y, or Z. You know, this is another thing that I think you also need to be aware of. And that is when a doctor says, or a so-called expert says, there's no evidence to support that, what they should really be saying is, I haven't read the evidence to support that. And between those two statements, there is a world of difference. The episode we have done with psychologist Julia Ruckledge was very insightful for me. She said, we need as people, but as practitioners, to be skeptical, but curious. And that really stuck with me. It's important for us to be skeptical, but curious. But at what point do most medical practitioners' curiosity kick in? And I would argue it is at the point in their education when they studied pathology, the study of disease, and pharmacology and surgery, how to manage those diseases. And from there, they're very curious. Well, they should remember that in the first few years of medical or health practitioners' degrees, we studied the basic science of anatomy, biochemistry, and physiology and histology, the study of cells, the study of biochemistry, what goes on in those cells, the study of physiology, how all those cells and systems within our body interact to keep us healthy. And if our curiosity, it came back a few years to the very beginning of our training, then that would be a wonderful place for medical practitioners to be. Skeptical, but curious. But when someone says to you there is no evidence to support it, well, here's a statistic. I've heard there is so much evidence out there at the moment that it takes something like 600 hours a week to keep up. Now, considering there's only 168 hours in a week and you sleep for a third of that, so it's not possible to keep up with all of the research. So I always preface what I don't know as I'm very pleased I'm very open to admit there's an awful lot I don't know. In fact, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And I'm learning a lot and I'm realizing I don't know a lot, which is exciting for me. I find that empowering. So anyway, I digress. Log on, find out about Defeat Diabetes. It is an independent, evidence-based, and therein lies a big difference as well, evidence-based approach to this big and growing problem, which doesn't just affect diabetes, it sets you up for every other comorbidity and complication of this pandemic and every other disease you can think of. Anyway, we'll have links to Defeat Diabetes. I'd recommend you go on there and log on and subscribe and become part of that community. I am very proud and pleased to be a supporter of that. I have made a commercial commitment to it without any suggestion that that will make a financial return at all. Not interested. I've often said the change has to come from the ground up, and I'm putting my money where my mouth is, quite literally. And I think it's well worth you logging on and supporting this as well. Hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.